Good afternoon. My name's Doug Irwin, and I'm Director of the Political Economy Project here at Dartmouth. And along with Andrew Samwick of the Rockefeller Center, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's events. Before I introduce the moderator, I just want to say a few words about the Political Economy Project, which is co-sponsoring this debate. The PEP is a new venture, just started this academic year, and it's designed to encourage student interest at the intersection of economics, politics, and philosophy. We have a bunch of new courses that we're co-sponsoring this coming academic year. And for all students, I have a list in case you're interested in tapping into some of those. They start this summer, but they go through all 4 quarters. We also have a Monday night student dinner where we invite a faculty member to come and speak in a very informal way over free food. So we hope that you can tap into that in the coming academic year. And also we hope to sponsor more events such as these, debates and public events and what have you. So the way to tap into us is to check out our website, Political Economy Project. Come see me after the debate, and be sure to get onto our list mail email service so that you can get informed about upcoming events. Let me introduce to you our moderator for today, Charlie Wheelan from the great Dartmouth class of 1988. Charlie is a well-known figure around here. He teaches for the Economics Department and the Rockefeller Center, and he's author of such books as Naked Statistics, Stripping the Dread from the Data, The Centrist Manifesto, and 10.5 Things No Commencement Speaker Has Ever Said. But he's here to moderate the debate, so the floor is yours, Charlie.
Thank you. Good afternoon. We are going to talk about inequality. And along with healthcare, is probably one of the most politically contentious and very interesting topics that the country has to confront. There are a lot of reasons that it's so interesting. The first is that at its core, income inequality, or wealth inequality, has some very interesting methodological questions, beginning with how we define and measure inequality. From there are related issues about things like social mobility, which drive a lot of how we feel about income inequality. Part of resolving our disagreement over this contentious issue, of course, is going to stem from how we define the problem itself. Hence, the first part of the debate that our 2 guests have been asked to take on, what is the problem? Separately, inequality raises profound philosophical questions, things like what is fair? What do we owe the most disadvantaged members of society? So, as Doug pointed out in his introduction, there is in fact a philosophy component here. These are questions that are usually relegated to other departments on campus, but the fact is that they drive a lot of our economics in terms of what it is you want to accomplish. And of course, if we disagree about what we want to accomplish philosophically, then of course we will disagree about the best way to get there. It turns out that economic analysis matters an awful lot as well. At bottom, we are going to be discussing market outcomes, and in particular, how market rewards offer rewards to capital and to labor, and in particular, how those have changed over time, and what, if anything, we ought to do to intervene. Every government in every developed country plays some role in shaping the markets for capital and labor, particularly through the creation of human capital, or education as it's more often known. And every country, at least every developed country, has some mechanism for redistributing wealth after the market has had its say. That leaves us with a huge continuum of possible policy interventions, ranging from, at one level, trying to elevate the productivity of folks who are not benefiting from current market outcomes, but also leaves us various options for just taking money from those who are doing quite well and redistributing it to those who are not doing well. Or perhaps we can discuss taking it from people who are doing well and giving it to other people who are doing well, which is what happens with some entitlement programs. But that brings us to the second part of the debate, which is what is the solution? And then, of course, aside from all of that, we have the politics. There are clearly defensible intellectual disagreements around this topic, many of which are going to be elucidated here. But it's also true that our system seems less capable of integrating different views and ameliorating these kinds of problems in the past, or at least the political discourse is far shriller than it has been at other points in the past. And our hope here is to turn up the substance and to turn down the volume. Now, here to do that, stepping into the debate, we have 2 both prominent economists, but also very thoughtful individuals. Both of these gentlemen on my left have been involved in academic issues related to this issue in many different kinds of ways, and both have made a commitment to writing and communicating about this issue for broader lay audiences. On my far left, on your right, Gregory Mankiw is professor of economics at Harvard University. He's taught macroeconomics, microeconomics, statistics, and principles of economics. He has also taught sailing. Now, should we get into yacht building, which is, if it goes in that direction, he might be able to weigh in on that.
Top 1%.
Right, the 1%, which,
They
just,
love that.
right, it's on the CV. Professor Mankiw is a prolific writer, as many of you probably know, for both lay publications and academic journals. His research includes work on price adjustment, consumer behavior, financial markets, monetary and fiscal policy, and economic growth. He's written 2 popular textbooks, which some of you may have used, an intermediate level textbook, Macroeconomics, and the introductory textbook, Principles of Economics. The latter has sold over 1 million copies and has been translated into 20 languages. From 2003 to 2005, Professor Mankiw served as chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors for the George W. Bush administration. Now, to my immediate left, in the center, Jared Bernstein is a senior fellow at the Center on Budget Policy and Priorities. From 2009 to 2011, he was the chief economist and economic advisor for Vice President Joe Biden, and also executive director of the White House Task Force on the Middle Class, and generally a member of President Obama's economic team. Mr. Bernstein's areas of expertise include federal and state economic and fiscal policies, income inequality and mobility, trends in employment and earnings, international comparisons, and the analysis of financial and housing markets. Prior to joining the Obama administration, Mr. Bernstein was a senior economist and the director of the Living Standards Program at the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. He is the author and co-author of numerous books for both popular and academic audiences, including Crunch, Why Do I Feel So Squeezed?, and 9 editions of The State of Working America. He has also published extensively in various lay publications, the New York Times, Washington Post, Financial Times, and others. I welcome you both. The terms of the debate are as follows. Greg Mankiw has agreed to kick off. Both of the folks up here will make 15-minute opening statements. They will then each have a 5-minute rebuttal period. I may ask some questions, and we may open it up for them to clarify and extend. At that point, we will turn it over to the audience. There are assistants who should have been passing out note cards. If you would like to write a question, please raise your hand now or later, and somebody will give you a card, write down the questions. Those will be brought up to me, and I will sort through them in hopes of kind of sorting it out so that I can ask the most commonly asked questions and keep the things moving along. But please feel free to write your questions down, and we hope to have a robust discussion. I will be the timekeeper. With that, I'll turn it over to Greg for his opening statement.
Thank you. It is a delight to be here at Dartmouth. I haven't been here at Dartmouth since I was a student in college myself and was visiting a friend who was here during Winter Carnival. Things seem a little less hazy to me than they did then. What I'd like to do is talk about 3 things. First, what the facts are. I'll do that briefly since I think they're relatively familiar. I'd like to talk about some of the explanations for the facts, why is what's going on. And then I'd like to turn to the policy issues, how we might respond to these. Okay, so what are the facts? The facts are that inequality is very high right now by historical standards. If you look at measures of inequality in the United States, you find that it was high in the early part of the 20th century, and it started declining, especially in the post-World War II years. It reached a low sometime in the 1970s, and then started coming up again, and we're back to where we were in the early part of the 20th century. So if you look at measures of inequality, it's like a big U. With the bottom of that U is sometime in the 1970s. That is means that it's more difficult if you're at the bottom of the income distribution. While inequality was falling and the economy was growing, we saw reductions in poverty. But basically over the past 40 years or so, we've seen poverty relatively flat. It's fluctuated over time with the business cycle, but there has not been substantial reductions in poverty. And that is it goes hand in hand with increasing inequality. So that's the sort of the bad news. Before I move on to the explanations for that bad news, let me sort of put in one piece of good news here, which is that if you take not a U.S. view, but a more global view, you actually come up with a somewhat different story. Inequality has been rising in other developed countries, so it's been increasing in much of Western Europe, for example. But if you take a completely global view, you look at all individuals around the world, you actually find a very different picture. Global inequality has actually been falling, and global poverty has been falling, even while the opposite has been true in the United States. Well, why is that? Well, that's because the past several decades has seen very rapid growth in Asia, in particular in China and India. And so you start off with many billions of people in very poor countries experiencing very rapid growth. And what you see is that global poverty has been falling, even as U.S. And global inequality has been falling, even as inequality has been rising in the United States. Now, that global perspective is something you might want to take as a global citizen, but it doesn't bring much solace to Americans. That is, if you tell Americans that inequality is rising and we're not making any progress against poverty, saying, don't worry, there's lots of Chinese unskilled workers who are doing quite well, that doesn't make them feel any better about the situation. But as citizens of the world, we should take some happiness in the fact that it's from a global perspective, inequality is falling and poverty is falling. So what are the reasons for rising inequality over the past several decades? Well, I'm going to talk about 5 hypotheses. And I really think of these not as alternatives, but as 5 forces at work happening more or less simultaneously. So force number 1 is what I'll call the race between education and technology. That is actually the title of a book by 2 of my Harvard colleagues, Claudia Goldin and Larry Katz. And what they argue is that technology and education are the primary drivers of inequality. Technology tends to increase inequality. Technological progress tends to increase the demand for skilled workers and reduce the demand for unskilled workers who increasingly find themselves replaced by technology. So if you think about, say, a typical professor today, I probably use less secretarial time than I did in the past because I can do a lot of things myself with my computer. So that technology makes me more productive and makes secretarial support less important. So and that's throughout the economy, where sort of skilled workers use the technology and become more productive, and unskilled workers are increasingly replaced by the technology. Goldin and Katz argue that's been true throughout history, but that until 1970, we were increasing the supply of skilled workers because educational advancement was increasing. So we had things like the GI Bill and increases in educational attainment associated with the post-World War II generation. And so while the technology was increasing the demand for skilled workers, the educational system was increasing the supply of them even faster, and as a result, inequality fell. Educational attainment then plateaued sometime in the 1970s, and as a result, technology started winning the race between education and technology. So that's hypothesis 1, and I think really a very important one. Hypothesis 2 is globalization and trade. Increasingly, we've been trading with other countries, in particular countries with large numbers of unskilled workers. So take China, for example. When we import goods from China, they're typically produced by unskilled workers, and we're buying T-shirts, say, from China, and we're exporting things like software, that are produced by skilled workers here. And what that does is that trade reduces the demand for unskilled workers domestically and increases the demand for skilled workers domestically, and as a result, once again, increases the relative wages of skilled workers relative to unskilled workers and increases inequality. So globalization and trade are part of the story. I don't think it's the main thing driving this, by the way, because if that were the main thing driving increases in inequality in the United States, we'd be seeing just the opposite in China. That is, they're exporting unskilled workers' goods and importing skilled worker goods. So you should see declining inequality in China, and we don't see that. In fact, inequality has also been rising in China. So I don't think trade and globalization is the main thing going on here, but it could be one of the things contributing to inequality. Immigration. Similar to trade, immigration can also affect relative wages of skilled and unskilled workers. If you look at the percentage of Americans that are foreign born, you see it basically, it very much mirrors the trends in inequality. Roughly 15% of the population was foreign born in 1930. That fell to about 5% in 1970, and then started increasing to about 13, 14% today. Well, why does it matter where people are born? Well, it turns out that foreign-born workers tend to be less educated than domestically born workers. 7% of native-born American adults have not completed high school. 27% of foreign-born adults in the United States have not completed high school. And this is true today. We see a lot of sort of relatively unskilled Mexican workers coming in. It was true a century ago when my 4 grandparents immigrated from Ukraine. None of them had more than a fourth grade education. So it's fairly common when immigrants come in, they're relatively less educated, and that affects the distribution of income in a couple ways. One is if you put a lot of unskilled workers at the bottom of the distribution, even if it has no effect on anybody else, that will mechanically increase inequality because they're then measured. But in addition, they compete with locally unskilled workers and tend to depress the wages of the unskilled relative to the skilled. Hypothesis 4, education, technology, globalization, immigration. Hypothesis 4, superstars. There's been several years ago, I guess 1981, Sherwin Rosen, an economist, wrote an article in the American Economic Review talking about the economics of superstars. Well, what is a superstar? A superstar is a person who can use his skills and reach a very, very wide market. You cannot be a superstar if you are a plumber. No matter, if you are the best plumber in the world, there's only a certain amount of people who you can service. On the other hand, if you're one of the world's best actors, you can ply your trade and sell to the entire world. I'm sure some of you have seen Robert Downey Jr. in Iron Man. Right? The Avengers was one of the most successful movies of all time. He made, just for making that one movie, $50 million. That one movie. Roughly speaking, 200 million people saw the movie. They each paid something like 25 cents to Robert Downey Jr. as part of the ticket price. And as a result, he could sell his services as an actor to the entire world. That was possible because of technology. You know, a century ago, he couldn't have sort of gone into a theater and acted in front of 200 million people. But today, by virtue of technology, he can provide his skills and become a superstar and make $50 million. That is increasingly the case, I believe, in the economy as people can expand their scope to worldwide markets. I do this in a small way by selling my textbooks around the world. I am actually I have the #1 selling economics textbook in South Korea, despite the fact until recently I'd never been to South Korea. I sit in my office at home in Massachusetts, write these books, send them off via email to my publisher, and by and large, all these students in South Korea are reading them. Now, unfortunately,
you don't know that they're reading.
Well, they're buying them. That's the only thing I care. They're buying them.
They're buying.
Yeah, they're buying them.
Sorry.
They're buying. Now, sadly, economics textbooks are not quite as popular as Iron Man movies, but we're working on that. Now, to what extent is that pervasive? It's hard to measure. It's very hard to measure the superstar phenomena, but I think increasingly things like CEOs are superstars. You're running companies that have worldwide scope, and as a result, the people at the top of the economic ladder, what's sometimes called super managers, are earning high rewards. The median CEO of a Fortune 500 company makes $10 million. That's partly because he's looking at a company that's has global reach, and his productivity is very high. Now, critics of this phenomena say CEOs don't deserve it. It's all they're just being screwed by they're just screwing the shareholders by putting their cronies on the board and getting paid excessive wages. I think it's probably not true in light of the fact that private equity companies that also hire CEOs pay them a lot of money, and there's no principal agent problem there. The private equity firm owns the entire company. If they thought the CEO wasn't worth it, they wouldn't pay him that much. And so those are 4 explanations. My 5th explanation particularly involves Dartmouth. You think of Dartmouth as a particularly elite educational institution. Of course, that's true, but it's also a very, very elite dating society, right? Here you have very, very smart people getting together and meeting other very, very smart people. Well, why is that important? Well, it turns out there's been a big increase in assortative mating. 40 years ago, if you looked at the income of husbands and the income of wives, they were negatively correlated. That means the higher the income of the husband, the less the wife earned. Why is that? Well, if you're a successful husband, your wife didn't need to work. And therefore, she's more likely to stay at home and raise the kids. Today, there's a positive correlation between husbands and wives' incomes. Why is that? Well, you're a Dartmouth grad male grad's going to go become a successful doctor, lawyer, banker. He marries a woman who's a Dartmouth grad who's going to become a successful doctor, lawyer, banker. You take 2 high incomes, put them in the same household, and what do you get? More inequality in household incomes. Okay, so those are the 5 explanations as to why I think we've seen increasing inequality. The race between education, technology, globalization, immigration, superstars, and more assortative mating. What do we do about this? In my last 5 minutes, let me talk about possible policy solutions. Well, one possibility is to treat the symptoms and not the disease. To say we have increasing inequality, let's use the tax, instead of trying to treat the ultimate causes, let's just sort of fix the outcomes by taxing the rich more and cutting taxes for people at the bottom of the income distribution. And that's in some sense what we've done in the past few years. CBO has data back to 1979 looking at the progressivity of the federal taxes, all federal taxes put together. And right now in 2014, the progressivity of the tax system is about as great as it's ever been. The top 1% pays about 35% of their income in taxes, which is back basically the level it was back when Jimmy Carter was president. The middle class and lower classes have tax rates that are near historic lows. The middle class pays about 14% of their total income in taxes. People at the bottom, about 4%. And so we have a fairly progressive tax system by the standards of recent history. That is going back to 79 when CBO starts their data. Now, one thing to say about this is you can agree whether this is good or bad, but one thing that's absolutely clear is that changes in progressivity are small compared to the changes in before tax incomes. So you can like the Ronald Reagan tax policy, you can like the Barack Obama tax policy, but either way, the differences between those two tax policies is minute compared to the differences in the distribution of income between 1970 and today. So that's relatively small potatoes. Now, there's a question of should we go to French-style tax rates? Should we go to 75%, as President Hollande of France suggested? And there are economists who said yes, but I think that's one I wouldn't agree with. The race between education and technology. What do we need is better educational system, educational reform. And I think that's what exactly those are hard to say. I can talk about that in a minute, but since I only have 2 minutes, I won't go into that. Mm-hmm. Trade restrictions, I think, would be the wrong way to go. That can make us more equal, but probably make us all equally bad off. So I don't think equality. I don't think we're going to be equally poor. So I don't want to go that way. Immigration is a tough one, as we've seen national debate on immigration. At the very least, we should allow skilled immigrants in. Every single college degree from an elite institution like this one, you should get a green card stapled to it. If you're not a U.S. citizen, we should let as many skilled immigrants in as we can. Unskilled immigrants is a harder one, which we can talk about some more later. Superstars are very hard. I actually don't think Robert Downey Jr. is it's a problem. If he wants to make great movies that everyone wants to watch, I don't think that's a problem for society. There are some superstars on the other side of this. I mean, Bernie Madoff was a superstar of a different sort, a superstar wealth diverter rather than a superstar wealth creator. We need to worry about those, but the superstar wealth creators are not a problem. And finally, assortative mating. I don't think the government's going to get involved in telling the rich Dartmouth grad not to stop marrying a rich Dartmouth grad. They're not going to say to the banker, I'm sorry, you can't marry another banker, you got to marry a poet. Because we're worried about increasing inequality. Some increases in inequality have social determinants, and those are things we just have to learn to live with. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
The poets may be more interesting, right?
I actually like the idea of making bankers marry poets. This is just such a pleasure to be here, and I'm really happy to be here with Greg, whose work I very much admire, and I was a little worried because I think he's such a careful thinker that I wouldn't find anything to disagree with. But don't worry, there's lots. Though I think on the facts, I agree with most of them, not all of them. I actually think our tax system is more regressive, and I think there's a way in which you were just conflating effective rates with marginal rates. We'll get into that. His list of causes I find all very relevant, and I'll push back accordingly. I want to thank Doug Irwin for putting this together and getting us up here, Charlie for moderating, Joanne Needham for helping me with logistics. I'm going to talk about problems and the problems that I view that are associated with inequality in ways that Greg alluded to but didn't get into very, very deeply. And then I'm going to raise a number of challenges, I hope, to kind of the unspoken tenor of Greg's talk, and he'll have an ample opportunity to disagree with me if I'm misinterpreting him. That said, this is going on, and in many ways, it's not nearly as it's not an obvious a problem, at least in the ways that I'm going to suggest it is. And in many ways, some of the solutions that have been proffered to address that problem are worse than the problem itself. This is at least my characterization of his view, and then I will argue differently. I think I have a few slides, but I may use them or not. 4 reasons why I think the very high levels of inequality, which we both agree are high in historical terms, are problematic. Fairness, absence of opportunity, threats to representative democracy, and macroeconomic instability. Now, fairness is not as squishy as it sounds. By fairness, what I really mean is that if you look at the trajectory of the incomes of people at different parts of the income or wage scale and productivity, that is the economy's output per hour, you'll find a very big split over the period where inequality increased relative to a period where inequality was flat. That is the median family or the median compensation right in the middle of the scale grew in lockstep with productivity for decades in the post-war period, say mid-40s to the mid-70s. In fact, low incomes, middle incomes, high incomes, all just about doubled from the mid-40s to the mid-70s. So that was a period where inequality wasn't a problem at all. Since then, productivity keeps trucking along. It's decelerated somewhat. It wiggles about. But the income of the middle has been flat. The income at the bottom has generally fallen. As Greg mentioned, poverty rates have been quite sticky. And this is not to say that everybody should get the average productivity growth rate, but it is a significant problem in an economy where year after year the economy expands, but people either fall behind or just tread water. That to me is one of the significant problems of inequality. There is a basic social compact or contract that says if you work hard, put in the hours, that you ought to be able to get ahead, and in fact your children ought to be able to do at least as well as you, if not better. And there's a sense among people that that contract's been broken by inequality, and I think that sense has actually some backing in the data. Opportunity, this is a very big one. In America, we are not 5-year planners, as P.G. Wodehouse used to call the Soviets. We don't believe that everyone should have equal outcomes. But we do at least arguably, and there was a period where this was a discussion about white males, that's for sure. So let's be clear, I don't want to sugarcoat the past. But we do generally believe that while equality of outcomes is not our desired goal, equality of opportunity is. I think there is increasing evidence that the level of inequality we have is actually raising the barriers to opportunity, such that high levels of inequality block income mobility and restrict opportunity. By the way, in much the way that Greg referenced when he was talking about education as a key solution to the problem. If the inequality barriers make it more difficult for a poor child to get a decent education or access to the kind of university experience that folks here have, not to mention the rich boyfriends and girlfriends they're going to meet, that's a way in which inequality interacts negatively with opportunity. For threat to representative democracy. I was actually going to write, I was thinking, what are the problems that inequality cause? I was going to write destruction of the world as we know it, but that felt a little dramatic. But in a way, I sort of feel that way a little bit. In a way, I'll tell you in a second. There are those sort of a bumper sticker that says that complains about money in politics, and it says $1, one vote. That's a bumper sticker, and it's not particularly accurate. However, I will argue, and I think quite strenuously, that the interaction of concentrated wealth and money in politics is hurting representative democracy in such a way that enforces inequality of income and wealth, that blocks a progressive agenda or even a centrist agenda that would push back on inequality, and is an existential threat when you start thinking about climate. That is, wealth concentration interacting with money in politics to block solutions to problems that we have, one of which is inequality, opportunity, and mobility, another which is just our ability to be effective stewards of our environment. So I think inequality at this point, as it interacts with our political system, is a threat to representative democracy, and it might even be worse than that once you start worrying about the impacts of climate. Macro instability. Income inequality is associated with something I call the shampoo economy, which is bubble, bust, repeat. This is a problem. This is a problem wherein, again, income inequality and high levels of wealth concentration interact with the regulatory function of government, folks that I hope here at the Rockefeller Institute are studying, in such a way as to promote financial bubbles, which may generate considerable macroeconomic growth at some point in the cycle, but then blow up and leave a huge mess in their wake. How much time do I have?
You have 7 minutes, 30 seconds.
Okay. That's very accurate. Before I get to I'm going to be very glib in my solutions because I'll get back to that. I just didn't want to cram everything into my opening statement. I'm going to tick through a list of about 15 things I just wrote off the top of my head as I was riding here from the Manchester airport that I think should make you think should make you, and especially make Greg, think twice and thrice about this idea that somehow our super managers and our super actors, even if they have superpowers, are being compensated in ways that have very little to do with their marginal product, with their willingness to work for less, and with anything that you would associate with the kind of a good, thoughtful economics that I associate with Greg Mankiw, and everything to do with what economists call rents, which is basically undeserved big pots of money. So I'm just going to tick through these, and by then I'll probably be just about done. There was a careful study. I thought it was a careful study. They have a thumb on the scale here. There was a careful study by a couple of academics that tried to ask this question: can we figure out whether CEOs are being paid for their actual contribution to the firm's bottom line, as Greg suggested with his PE example, or through luck? This was Bertrand et al. And here's a quote: "Oil CEOs are paid for luck that comes from oil price movements." So they were able to link the compensation of oil CEOs in the oil industry, to movements in prices that had everything to do with, well, they called it luck, but really had to do with the global supply of oil, not to do with the CEO's skills. Very high earner. Can I have my first slide, please? If you look at the top line there, that shows the earnings of those in the top 1%, and I pulled out their earnings in that little graph to the left and matched it to the stock market. The very high earnings of those at the top 1% move with the stock market, not with anything that I would associate with their contribution to the firm at the margin, or certainly with their skills. There's no story that says the top 1% became very unskilled for a few minutes there in the late 2000s and late 90s, and then somehow skilled up again as inequality bounced back. And by the way, I don't believe that the technology and education story gets you very far here in the context that Greg was raising, because much of the movement in inequality has been among the top 1% or even the top 10th of the top 1%, and they're all college grads. In fact, if you look at the premium, the college premium, the premium that college-educated workers get over high school-educated workers or non-college-educated workers, it's been flat for over 10 years. It's been flat since the late 1990s, yet inequality is going up. So it can't be an education story. These are all college grads. There's something going on in the top 1%, the top 10th of 1%, that has nothing to do with certainly the kinds of skills that are bequeathed at college. Like I said, they're all college grads. Go to the next slide. Look at the slide on the left. If you just look at that top line on the left, that's the ratio of pay at the top 1%, CEO pay at the top 1% to everybody else's wages. And it sort of cooks along since the late 1940s at the average level, and then when inequality takes off, it takes off. I can think of no story about skill returns, about you're paid your marginal product, about you're somehow not getting these bundles of rents from the system that you've somehow rigged to your advantage, that you're kind of, in a way that I thought Greg was too dismissive of, that somehow goes up to that doesn't seem to really start until you get to the 99.9th percentile. That somehow there's a real discontinuity in returns to skill starting that high in the scale. I think that's suggestive of what economists call rents or undeserved large pay packages. Financial innovation, overpaid. We see the superstars, or at least the actors and the singers and all those they're a minority share of the top 1%, maybe 20%. Most of the people in the top 1% are executives and financiers, I would argue that they have that their pay has certainly not reflected risks that they've engendered to the whole economy. There are race and gender differentials, and I'd very much like to. I mean, Greg knows that they exist. I'd very much like to hear Greg's thinking in that regard. We know that there are differentials, even when you control for all the observable skills. There are gender differentials and race differentials. Expensive people get big cash outs even after they screwed up. Here's a headline I wrote down from a few months ago. Fined billions, J.P. Morgan gives Diamond a raise. Okay, so again, I think that's evidence of rent extraction. There are what I call Thomas Piketty effects. Okay, so Thomas Piketty wrote this famous book on inequality, which shows that as the share of capital income increases, as a share of national income, there's more inequality simply because capital itself is more unequal, and capital itself becomes a larger part of the economy. So as the part of the economy, capital income versus labor income, as the part of the economy that's more inherently unequal grows as a share, according to Thomas Piketty, it likely will grow as a share, and there's, I think, good arguments on both sides of that. That in itself will not only increase inequality, but increase inherited inequality, which I think is quite divorced from any skill story or deserved kind of story you want to tell. Finally, I just wrote down big profits in the pharmaceuticals. So I'm really just kind of cherry picking examples here throughout the economy where I think a benign story about super people getting what they ought to be getting is quite easily disproved. I was just reflecting on the extent to which certain drugs are much more expensive here than the same drugs are in Europe. Clear example of what we call rent-seeking behavior, or somebody with a friend in a high place getting more than they should. The solutions to the problem, which I'll go into later because I don't want to go over my time, have to do with increasing the bargaining power of middle and low wage workers. Part of that has to do with the fact that there's less unions, lower minimum wages, things that public policy could actually make a difference in. Part of that has to do with the absence of full employment. We really need tight labor markets. The last time we saw inequality behaving in a way that I thought looked very positive from the perspective of at least middle and low income people was in the latter 1990s when we had a full employment economy. Progressive taxation. The reason why you see the effective tax rates, the reason why you see the top 1% paying more of the taxes than they ever had is not because the tax system is more progressive now than it used to be. By the way, it is more progressive now than it was a few years ago. It's less progressive than it was in the late 1970s, for example. The reason they've been paying most of the taxes is because they've been getting most of the income. Their effective tax rates, their tax liability of their share of their income has actually gone down. Mobility very much related to education, and I'll say more about that later. I very much agree on that point.
Okay, we now have 5-minute rebuttals. So, Greg?
Let me on the last point, taxes as a percentage of income. The numbers I was citing were taxes as a percentage of income. They weren't the share of the tax liabilities. It was their effective tax rate. According to CBO, the effective tax rate of the top 1% is basically back to where it was in '79. Let me just sort of go back. Jared raised 4 issues: macro stability, threat to democracy, absence of opportunity, and fairness. Let me do this. I'm going to do this in reverse order. First, in macro instability is a big issue. In fact, as a macroeconomist, I spend a lot of time thinking about that. I'm not sure it's connected to inequality particularly. I mean, we had this big recession recently, and inequality's been high. But before that, we had a period of what's called the Great Moderation, a period of very stable macroeconomic performance with high inequality. So I don't see those. I think those two very important phenomenon. I don't see them as connected. as Jared does. As a threat to democracy, we can talk about campaign finance reform. I don't tend to be an expert on this, but let me note a couple things. One is we're in a period now of high inequality, and we have the most progressive president we've had, maybe in my lifetime, elected, Barack Obama. So this idea that the rich are going to get their way. I worked for Mitt Romney last time. If the rich got their way, I wouldn't be working at Harvard right now. So I'm less convinced that sort of the money has this big an influence on politics as Jared is. I should know that there are rich people giving lots of money to politics, but there's people on the right, like the Koch brothers, people on the left, like Soros, and there's this guy whose name I've forgotten right now, who's giving lots of money to support global warming. So I think the billionaires have the variety of concerns, and they give money for a variety of different things. And I don't see them as being nearly as influential as he does. Absence of opportunity, I think this is maybe one place we agree. The way I would do is focus on I would spend a lot more time focused on the educational system. So, I had mixed feelings about No Child Left Behind, but pursued by George Bush, who I worked for. But I have no doubt that on thinking about trying to reform our educational system to make it better was the right thing to do. Whether he had the particular right reforms, I don't know, and I think that's a lot of people debate that. But I think focusing on that is tremendously important. I think also focusing on access to higher education is tremendously important. One of my favorite ideas floating around is from Luigi Zingales at the University of Chicago, who says that college students should be able to sell equity in themselves. And by that he means, instead of taking a college loan, go to an entrepreneur who says, look, you pay for my college and I'll pay you some 2-3% of my income for the next 30 years. And the IRS could actually get involved in helping to enforce such a contract because the IRS observes your income. And that seems like a great creative way of helping to spread the risk of getting a college degree, much better than our current system of student loans. And the question on fairness, to what extent is unfair? And I think it's great I want to end on this because fairness is not a word that economists particularly know how to define. So when you talk about fairness, you have to realize that you're going beyond economics. You're going into political philosophy. Is it unfair that Robert Downey Jr. made $50 million? Is it unfair that George Clooney looks like he looks like and I look like I look like? No. No, in some ways it's not fair, but is that the sort of thing you want the government to be regulating and saying, oh, this is unfair and now I'm going to move resources around? I'm basically a skeptic of the powers of government in interfering in our lives, and that's a statement of political philosophy, not a statement of economics. And as a result, I don't want the government to go around saying this is fair and that's not fair. Bernie Madoff, I'm perfectly happy to have him say that's not fair because that's clearly wealth diversion, and I think there's other examples of wealth diversion. Then we could argue about that and try to fix it. But I think if somebody has super talents, as Robert Downey Jr. does, and as some super managers do, I don't think that's the government's role to try to remedy that. But as I said, that's not a statement of pure economics.
All right.
So just because Mitt Romney lost doesn't mean the rich don't have disproportionate influence in politics. I mean, I feel very strongly about that. It's certainly the case that the very rich are not able to buy elections. I grant you that. That's not dispositive, in my view, of where I was coming from. And in fact, the fact I looked this up today, and it may not be, I'm not sure this number is still correct. This is a 2010 number from a source that that looked pretty journalistic to me. But there's something like 5 lobbyists per member of Congress right now. And so unless that's the biggest market failure I've ever heard of, it doesn't surprise me at all that wealth is playing a disproportionate role in our politics and doing things that I think an objective person, economist or not, would recognize as unfair. And I'll get into some of them in a second. Look, on the Robert Downey Jr. problem, I actually think that there's a probably rent-seeking or some kind of an inequality problem there as well, although I think in many ways it's your best argument because, as you say, the superstars do have great access. I will remind you that they're a relatively small share of the top 1%. In many ways it's the folks in the boardroom I worry more about. But I guess and this is me just completely hypothesizing off the top of my head, I'll bet you that Robert Downey Jr. would have done the Iron Man movie for $40 million. and been happy to do so. Why didn't he? I think there's a positioning going on between those at the very top of the scale there, and that the only way Robert would do it for 40 is if Leonardo DiCaprio would do it for 38 or something like that. That is, there's a kind of positional inequality problem that has little to do with actual contributions to the economy's health and more to do with where you are relative to somebody else. Embedded in that is the fact that at the very bottom end of the pay scale, and here you could probably talk about folks who are working on the movie set who used to make a lot more 30 years ago than they do now. Embedded in that are the kind of power relations, bargaining power, eroded labor standards, less unions, lower minimum wages, weaker job markets that help, that enable, along with globalization and technology, that enable a Downey to get what he gets. So look, I think Greg brings us into a very important area when he raises, the issue when he raises the issue of fairness and whether we can have a decent discussion about that among economists. I think if we don't, we're missing the show. We're really just seeding the field. We're economists, we're ivory tower, we live in a standard, we can't judge what's fair. I think that's a very big mistake. Let me throw out a few things that I see as patently unfair, and maybe there's a better word for it, feel free to but I'd like you to respond as to say, if that's okay, because this is sort of another round, is that okay with you? So I'd like you to respond and explain why either this is fair or unfair is the wrong word for it, as you will. So the carried interest loophole. So this is where people who are stock traders are able to pay taxes on their earnings at lower rates, at the rates that you pay on capital income, which are considerably lower than the highest rates they would pay on labor income, because of a loophole in the tax law. So I'd like to hear, whether that's fair. I think the fact that the pharmaceutical lobby has manipulated patents in such a way as to make the same drugs, much more expensive here than they were over there. Than they are in say, other advanced economies. This idea that there are CEOs paid for movements, global movements in prices that don't seem to have much to do with their skills or what they're bringing to the table. They're getting paid for profitability that has to do with prices set on a global market. And one I don't think I mentioned, high frequency traders. I think high-frequency traders are seeking rents in the stock market by literally co-locating servers closer to the market than other traders and catching arbitrage price opportunities in milliseconds. So that strikes me as unfair. By the way, none of these by themselves would move the needle a ton on inequality. I'm not arguing that. I'm saying that these are examples, and I could go on with many more. I suspect my 5 minutes is about up. I could go on with many more. I tried to tick off many during my talk that strike me as not only unfair, but as unfair in precisely the way that boosts inequality.
Okay.
All right, so I'll remind you all, if you have questions, fill out your cards, and they will make their way down to me. In the meantime, Greg, if you would answer those questions, then you have
I'll be
a chance to ask some of your own.
Sure, I will be very brief. Carried interest. I've actually written that I think we probably should reform the carried interest laws. I mean, my ideal tax system would be have progressive consumption tax. So you'd be taxing on when you consumed, regardless of how you earned it. And you wouldn't have to debate things like carried interest. But I think the carried interest exemption is problematic. It's a very, very small percentage of the population. Pharmaceuticals and drugs in Europe, I think that's an interesting policy question. Drugs are cheaper in Europe. That's partly has to do with price discrimination. It partly has to do with price controls in Europe. Drugs have this feature that they're very big fixed costs and very low marginal costs. The big fixed costs is inventing the drug, and then it's basically very, very cheap once you've figured out how to do it. If we're going to incentivize drug companies, somebody's got to pay well above marginal costs to pay for the fixed costs to get the drugs invented in the first place. Sadly, Americans have been paying more than their share than the Europeans. I view it as the problem with European price controls. The Europeans are free riding, but so I view that sort of a very distinct issue from the U.S. inequality issue. CEO pay for performance. CEOs are compensated often as a function of their stock price. one of the puzzles in the literature on CEO compensation is they're compensated as a function of their stock price, and it should, we would think, be their stock price relative to the overall stock market. So you'd think that they'd be compensated only when their price moves relative to the overall market or relative to the overall market in that industry, say, and that's not the way the contracts are written. That's a bit of a puzzle. I don't know the answer to that, why that is. It seems like if you were writing an optimal CEO contract, you would write it that way. And on high-frequency traders, we may agree here. There's a great new book out by Michael Lewis. I'm a big fan of Michael Lewis's work. There's one called Flash Boys. I don't know the details of high-frequency trading, but he argues that a large fraction of high-frequency traders are basically a form of wealth diverters rather than wealth creators. And I think that it may be the case. I'd say, by the way, that Wall Street's a hard case for economists, for me at least, to understand in the following sense. I want to make this distinction between wealth creators like Robert Downey Jr. and wealth diverters like Bernie Madoff. According to Michael Lewis, a lot of the high-frequency traders are basically wealth diverters. They're not doing something illegal like Bernie Madoff. So it's a legal form of wealth diversion, but it's still wealth diversion, and as a result, probably requires new and better regulations to try to avoid it. But a lot of what people are doing on Wall Street is not wealth diversion, it's wealth creation. They are doing stuff like deciding which industries are the industries of the future. When you invest your saving, put it in a mutual fund, what companies are going to get invested in, what industries are going to grow, which industries are going to shrink. That is among the most important jobs in the economy. They are deciding the future of the American economy. So it makes perfect sense to me that Wall Street's going to hire some of the smartest people. A lot of you students who are here are probably going to go to Wall Street, right? Some of the most smartest students in the world. Does it make sense for you to go to Wall Street? It probably does from the social standpoint, because you're going to be deciding the future of the U.S. economy. And you may be doing it just to get rich. But that's the magic of the invisible hand. But the jobs certainly have high social value if you make the right decisions. And that's certainly how people, let's say private equity, who take long-term stakes in companies, often get rich. Mitt Romney got rich by helping create Staples and a lot of other companies like that. That, to me, is wealth creation and not wealth diversion.
So I have a very different perspective on the wealth creation diversion question, particularly in financial markets. Does this work? If you could put up one of my slides, my second slide, that would be good. But if you can't, don't worry about it. Okay. What I kind of heard Greg just all right, well, never mind. I don't want to mess around with that. What I kind of heard Greg describe there sounded like kind of the financial market, or the equity market anyway, that I was taught about in grad school, and that I fear doesn't really exist anymore. And that was the one that takes excess savings from the economy and most efficiently allocates it to its most productive uses. And I wish that were the case, but I'm afraid it's not. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the slide on the right there. What I have observed financial markets mostly do, and there's some of that, but what I've observed financial markets doing much too much of in recent years is essentially figuring out innovative ways to extract wealth from the economy in ways that kind of circulate around the top and help explain that graph on the left with the super returns to the super managers without showing up in productivity, which demonstrably is the case, and equally demonstrably the case, showing up in, at least in the last couple of business cycles, in very serious financial crashes. Okay? So I think it's actually very tough to make an argument that somehow financial markets are allocating capital to their most productive use versus diverting wealth, extracting wealth, creating, helping to inflate bubbles that once they burst, wreak havoc on the vast majority of the workforce, while in fact the one sector of the economy that recovered before everybody else was the financial sector itself, in no small part due to help from taxpayers. So I see this financialization of the economy is actually a problem in two ways. It's a problem in terms of macroeconomic instability, and it's a problem in terms of income inequality. On the effective tax rate problem, and this is related to this, I think we have a factual disagreement which we can figure out ourselves. I didn't. I'm picturing a graph, and this isn't the CBO data, so I'm not. I have to go back and look at that. I'm picturing a graph that shows the effective tax rate of the top, 400 taxpayers that the IRS releases every year, and it's gone down a lot. So I do think that as part of a solution to this, we should have more progressive taxation. That should start at the top of the scale. And one thing that would help both in terms of more progressive taxation and dampening some of this financialization problem, this volatility that I think is wealth diverting and macroeconomically instability creating, is a financial transaction tax. A tax on financial, a very small couple of basis point tax on financial transactions that would generate significant revenue, $350 billion over 10 years as scored, and help to dampen both some of this rent seeking and some of this instability.
All right, I have two follow-up questions. So, Greg, would you support a financial transactions tax if it were small, based on the theory that if capital gets to its most productive use by 4 o'clock, it doesn't really matter if it gets there at 3:58?
Well, I mean, a couple of things that I don't want to look at before I sign on to that. One is to what extent these things can just move overseas. I mean,
So let's posit that it's harmonized.
Yeah,
financial track.
I agree with that criticism.
Okay. So, there's a question of whether we can move overseas. And then the question is, do you want supranational or, I mean, the problem is, I don't know what harmonized means. I mean, you can get London to agree, but this is the Barbados. I mean, do you want literally the United Nations to enforce this in every small country in the world? I'm not probably willing to cede economic policy to the United Nations, given its effectiveness and organization and other dimensions. Right. I'm kind of nervous about that. The other issue is, high frequency traders may have some negative aspects, but they also have some positive aspects, which means they create liquidity. If you want to sell a stock, you can do it very quickly at a very small bid-ask spread. If you want to sell your house, it takes 6 months, and the bid-ask spread is quite high if you can do it quickly. So. There's some benefits to the high-frequency traders as well. So I think the question is what regulations we should have for them, I think, is a very important one, and I think it needs to be debated. But I think it's fairly hard, and I think sort of looking at the whole activity and saying this is all negative is probably an overstatement. In any event, I think it's a fairly small fraction of what Wall Street does. I think the number of people who actually engage in high-frequency trading as opposed to longer-term positions is fairly small.
All right, so follow-up for Jared. So Greg mentioned a progressive consumption tax. You guys would probably quibble over the rates, but would you support a consumption tax, progressive, if it meant then I assume zero tax on capital gains until they're consumed?
Yeah,
Is that
yes.
Every economist wants to do that, and every tax discussion always ends with a progressive consumption tax, or maybe just a consumption tax, and then the good guys say, well, it should be progressive. And I'm sort of just, I think it has attributes that I definitely support. I think both theoretically and in the real world, it has real efficiencies. I agree. It ain't going to happen. I live in a world where you really have to wrestle with tax policy, and I hope that many of the students here go out and wrestle in that world as well. I think that before we can start fantasizing about a progressive consumption tax, we should think about fixing a pretty broken tax system of our own right here. The rates that, and it's part of the inequality problem, the rates on labor income are typically higher than they are on capital income. It's one of the things that has created the kinds of problems that Thomas Piketty is writing about. The inefficiencies and loopholes in the code are such that you can, if you're smart enough, you can buy the tax return you want. There are big international players, multinational corporations, who pay a tiny fraction of what they should pay in the tax code. So before I'd think about a progressive consumption tax, I would try to think about actually reforming our current system in ways that probably Greg and I would agree on in terms of closing a bunch of loopholes. One quick thing. We have another factual disagreement here, but it's very narrow and very small and very in the weeds. There's and it's one paper, and you may know this literature better than I. I was very moved by a paper by a guy named Eric Budish. Have you seen this paper? Okay. He and his colleagues seem to look very carefully at this high-frequency trading issue with great data, and I mean like to the millisecond. And they concluded that, in fact, high-frequency trading reduces liquidity. And the reason it reduces liquidity, I wrote about this on my blog, jerrybernsteinblog.com. The reason it reduces liquidity is because you've got high-speed traders that are sniping stale quotes. And when you're a non-high-speed trader, you can really get burned in that situation. So they found it reduces liquidity.
Okay, question for each of you very quickly on tax reforms. This seems to be an area of overlap. Yes or no on capping or eliminating the home mortgage interest deduction?
Yeah, I'd eliminate it.
You're not running for office, I see. I feel I'd phase it out slowly.
Of course, you phase it out. All right. All right. The only thing I'm surprised.
I am running.
There will be security to lead you out. The only thing I'm surprised neither of you mentioned is family structure. So did you?
I thought you
so
said
not
that.
asort of mating, the flip side. So the rise in single-parent households, and thinking of it as the opposite of asort of mating, in that it tends to be low-income households, so it exacerbates not only the one earner, one oar in the water, but also fewer resources to spend on children.
Yeah, when people, we didn't talk about this data, but sometimes people look at things like median household income or median family income, and that data is particularly affected by household composition. Because if you have more single-family households, so people are splitting up, that's going to tend to reduce the median of the family, and that's absolutely true. There's a guy at Cornell named Richard Burkhauser who's done a lot of work about that, and talks about why it is that some of the median numbers you see are maybe misleading for the reasons like that.
Yeah, you still get, once you make those adjustments, you still get very significant increases in inequality. You can't explain it away by
Yeah,
by
that's why I
changing
didn't bring it
the
up, yes.
I wrote a piece that a short answer to the question is, I wrote a piece that I encourage you to read if you're interested in this, just an article that was in the New York Times called something like why marriage isn't as great a solution to poverty as you think it is, something like that. And the idea was, this was around the 50th anniversary of the war on poverty, and there were a lot of people who were kind of going around saying, if only people would get married more, we'd have less poverty. And there's definitely some truth to that. And by the way, there's a lot of truth to the effect that a two-parent, all else equal, a two-parent family, kids who grow up in two-parent families have better child outcomes than kids who grow up in one-parent family. So I'm not disparaging at all that research. I think that the idea that single parenthood itself is a cause of increasing poverty, or something that you could even do much about with public policy, is somewhat overblown. So read that article and see what you think.
Okay. So some with cards, you guys can start collecting cards. Meanwhile, question for both of you, start with Greg. You've stated your policies on income inequality, but what policies that you hear from people who care a lot about income inequality would be most desirable to you, irrespective of income inequality? So whether it's universal pre-K education or something, you say, you know what, I kind of like that, even if I don't share their underlying motivation.
I'm not sure exactly what that category is, but things like letting skilled immigrants in. I think even if we weren't worried about income inequality, I think letting skilled immigrants in would be an absolutely good idea. I think providing sort of better access to higher education is an absolutely good idea. And figuring out different ways of dealing with educational reform at the pre-college level is an absolutely great idea. I think they would help inequality, but I think they're sort of fundamentally good policies in and of themselves.
Okay. So I want to respond. I don't think that we've quite done enough on policy, frankly. We've kind of blown by some things, but I actually think there are a lot more we could do in that space. One thing that I'd like to say about this is that there is a kind of a thread, and I think I hear it a little bit in Greg's argument, that says, I actually don't want to do anything really much to the top. Maybe you'd close the carry interest loophole, but basically they're doing fine because they deserve it. I want to help the bottom. So Greg mentions educational access, better access to education, particularly for folks in the bottom half of the scale. It's key. It relates exactly to this problem I mentioned earlier of inequality reducing opportunity. However, inequality itself blocks those solutions. You can't shut that off. You can't ignore the top and somehow help the bottom when the top itself, through money in politics in part, through lobbies, through intensive lobbying against increasing tax revenue, which is a real problem. So we're going to need more revenue if we want to have better educational access, right? And so the linkage there, at least to me, is very clear. Our high levels of inequality are blocking the very policy solutions that would reduce inequality, particularly in areas of educational access. One other policy I would put forth is, because I think that weak labor markets, the absence of jobs, the absence of pressure in the job market is so important. I mean, unless employers face such a tight job market that they have to raise the wages and benefits of the workers they need to get and keep those workers, they have to bid their compensation up. I would do some direct job creation. I would actually help the long-term unemployed, folks who face discrimination in the job market, by directly creating employment, for example, to help improve infrastructure. So I would do some direct job creation.
Can I ask Jared a question?
Sure.
The typical top earner now and the top marginal tax rate, not the carried interest person, but the typical successful corporate lawyer, say, who's paying normal tax rates. If you live, say, in New York City, pays New York City, New York State, top federal taxes, plus the new Medicare tax and so on, faces a marginal tax rate of probably about 50%.
Where does that start in their income? Like a million or something?
I mean, probably, I don't know, 400,000, say. So where would you raise, how high would you raise the top marginal tax rate? So if not 50, how high would you raise the top?
Well, I think 50 is getting up there. Now, I think that what I would probably do is I would lower the threshold so that more people would enter. You remember President Obama ran this election? You remember President Obama ran this election and said that he was going to increase taxes on people above 250,000. Well, it ended up he increased the tax on people above 450,000. So what I would do is I would increase the tax liability of folks at the top of the scale, not by cranking up the marginal rates you mentioned. Now that's New York State. You've combined everybody. That's probably higher than some people in other states. But I would lower their threshold so that more people were in that category. Now there is a literature on this by colleagues of yours that says you could go up at least on labor income to 60, 70% That makes me a little nervous, but I do think that lowering the threshold would help.
All right.
I mean, so it's really it's the upper, what some people call the upper middle class. I mean, and
well, let me be very clear. Yes, exactly. That's
Okay,
right.
okay.
But let me be very clear. I agree with something I think you're getting at, and I've written this. We cannot solve our fiscal problems simply by raising taxes on folks at the very top of the scale. The idea that if we truly want to, and I believe we should, be able to afford this many government services, we're going to need to raise more revenue than this. You got to bring those together, and we can't do that simply on the top 1 or 2%.
All right, we got a lot of cards. Let me start with the ones where we've got repeats here. A lot of folks would like to have you both weigh in on the minimum wage, and in particular, obviously, balance the trade-off between higher incomes for those affected and loss of employment.
I'm sorry, what was that? I was thinking of something else.
The minimum wage,
Oh,
in
minimum
particular,
wage.
and both of you walk us
Minimum wage.
walk us through the trade-off that all economists are familiar with, and what
want
the
me to go first?
CBO laid out.
So, if you increase the minimum wage in any sort of a meaningful way, there will be some job loss. If you just increase the minimum wage a tiny bit and it doesn't affect anybody, then sure, it won't matter. But if you increase the minimum wage, and they're talking about $15 an hour in Seattle, the president wants to go up to $10.10. By the way, with phase-ins, so it doesn't mean tomorrow. So let's be clear about that. I don't disagree with the Congressional Budget Office that did a recent study. I thought they were high on this, but they did a recent study where they found that they predicted that an increase in the minimum wage in 3 years to $10.10 would lead to about 24 million people getting an increase in their wages and about 500,000 people losing jobs. That's something like a 98, 99% effective target rate. 24.5 million people get a raise. Some people lose their jobs. It's not a perfect policy. It needs to be complemented with strong, say, wage subsidies through an earned income credit. But it's a very important policy whose benefits far outweigh its costs. You know, everything in moderation.
I would eliminate the minimum wage.
So
because
much for moderation.
because I think we have much better policies to help people at the bottom of the income distribution. I think the earned income tax credit is a much better policy. And in fact, it's a policy that has been expanded over the past several decades and has gotten support from both sides of the aisle. And so I think given that we have a better policy than minimum wage, I would focus on the earned income tax credit. There is a debate in the economics literature, by the way, about how big the adverse employment effects are. Jared certainly cited one credible part of the literature that has relatively small effects. I think you can find a range of estimates out there. But let me point out that if you believe the effects of increasing the minimum wage on employment are small, then you believe the labor demand curve is relatively steep. It was fairly inelastic to those students who are taking economics. If you believe the demand curve is relatively inelastic, then you believe that shifts in supply would have a huge effect on the wage. So if you believe that the minimum wage has a small effect on the unemployment, then you probably believe that the influx of unskilled immigrants has a huge effect on their wages, because you can't have it sort of both ways. I don't know what the truth is, but if you're not very worried about the minimum wage disemployment effects, you have to be really worried about the unskilled immigrants effects.
A couple of people would like you to weigh in on the role of inherited wealth in regard to income inequality, and then obviously your views on the estate tax.
Well, I mean, I think in the context of our discussion, it's funny. It's like, sometimes, especially when not with someone as balanced as Greg, but you go on CNBC, which I do, and you start having these discussions, and someone argues, oh, you hate the rich, or you're an enemy of the job creators, or I don't begrudge people their I don't begrudge people their success at all. I do think that when you get into inheritances, there you have a very tough argument to make that somehow this is deserved. I mean, there are people running around America who were born on third but thought they hit a triple, and I think that I think that is problematic. In a sense, again, I don't know if folks have read this book by Thomas Piketty, but I think that's problematic in a sense of his kind of economic mechanics, which suggests that this problem will only get worse. As long as the rate of return stays pretty high relative to the growth rate, we'll see more and more inheritances. He has pretty good historical data to support that. I'm not sure he's right about the future, but he certainly makes a cogent argument. And so therefore, an estate tax that targeted some of that wealth at the very top of the scale would very much be warranted. And it is a scandal the extent to which Congress has not gone there, and in fact allowed the debate to make it sound like when you're talking about a wealth tax that's really on the top half of the top 1%, it's somehow going to ding middle class people. That's absolutely false.
I want to tell you the story of two brothers. The names are Spendthrift Sam and Frugal Frank. They both graduate from Dartmouth, start businesses. Both are successful. After a few years, they both sell their businesses for $20 million, and they sit back to enjoy the rest of their lives. Spendthrift Sam has lavish parties, buys fancy cars, fancy women, spends all his money, so when he dies, it's all gone. Frugal Frank lives modestly, lives in a small middle-class home, mows his own lawn. When he dies, he wants to leave his money to his kids. Do we think that Frugal Frank should pay higher taxes than Spendthrift Sam? That's what the estate tax does. The estate tax says, if you're frugal, sorry, you got to pay extra taxes. We don't like frugal people. Now, see, I don't actually, sometimes you think of capital income as unearned income. It's often referred to as unearned income. I hate that phrase because you earn capital income by not consuming your earnings in the past. Capital income is the return to patience. So you've earned it by being patient, not spending your money. Now, it's true that the person who's inheriting the money didn't earn it, but his parents earned it. And you can't deny the person the inheritance without denying the parent the ability to bequeath. And so taxing, so you basically tax, and from my view perspective, what the inheritance tax does is it says we, the government, much prefer spendthrift Sam to frugal Frank, and we're going to institute a tax policy that does that. I personally don't see that as just, and so therefore I'd eliminate the estate tax.
So I would just say to say that it's denying the inheritance is way over the top, because what we're talking about with an estate tax is a marginal tax rate on the very top 1 or 2% after you forgive. What's the cutoff? I can't even remember what the cutoff now, but there's some number of millions of what is it?
5 million.
5 million for a couple. It's 5 million.
No, 10 million.
10 million for a couple. So you're deducting 10 million for a couple before you're applying a marginal tax rate. So I think it's very much a mischaracteristic. Even though I think your story is a very good defense, to end with, and that's somehow denying the inheritance as opposed to shaving a piece of it off, I think is just overstating the case.
So we'll call that a matter of degree.
Yeah.
Okay, so the top 20 hedge managers in the U.S. collectively make more than 150,000 kindergarten teachers. So we'll assume the math is correct. Two questions, one from here, one my own. So does it make you somewhat uncomfortable? This is mostly, I guess, for Greg, because how does it fit into the Robert Downey story? And probably the more substantive question, I guess, is given that we now know from things like the Tennessee Star experiment and so on that good teachers actually matter a lot, are there things you would do in particular on the school reform front to channel more money to those teachers who actually are creating a lot of value?
Oh, yeah, I'm not an expert on educational reform, but I would focus on two things on educational reform. One is I probably would pay teachers more, but then I'd also make it easier to fire them, because I think there's a lot of evidence that good teachers matter a lot, and so we need to get good people into teaching, and low salaries don't encourage that, so higher salaries is a good thing. But then also when the people don't perform, we should figure out ways to fire them. And stories that you hear about sort of bad teachers sitting in rooms because they can't get fired, and but nobody wants to put them with students, which New York City does, is a travesty. Now the hedge fund manager, I've always been puzzled a little bit about hedge funds. Hedge fund managers make a lot of money. Do they really outperform the market? Well, sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. I have wondered, like if I were advising Dartmouth or Harvard, would I tell them to invest their endowment in hedge funds? They all do. I'm not actually sure it's a wise thing. I put my own money in index funds. I pay Vanguard 10 basis points. So I don't have a single dollar with a hedge fund. So but if people want to put their money, if Dartmouth wants to put their money with hedge funds, I can't stop Dartmouth from doing that. That's Dartmouth's decision.
Jared, you want to talk about educational reforms? In particular, there are things, Greg pointed out, making it easier to fire bad teachers and so on, that would certainly help folks who are coming out with the short end of the stick in terms of income inequality. So are there things like limiting tenure, promoting charter schools, things that are more closely associated with a conservative agenda that might actually help, in your view, on the income inequality side?
I think the firing teacher thing is kind of like a Republican talking point. I haven't seen, if you could show me some evidence that somehow making it easier to fire teachers would help improve the quality of schools, I'd definitely be happy to look at it.
We can call my wife. She teaches at Mascoma High
That's
School.
not
I think
evidence.
she would weigh in. It's anecdotal evidence.
Exactly. And something
Yeah,
beyond.
you said any evidence.
Okay,
It's
sorry.
all right.
Any non-anecdotal evidence.
Yeah.
This debate is fraught with anecdotes, and I would say it needs much more than that. Here's the thing, and again, I really do think we have an anecdotal problem here. I'm actually quite sympathetic to the idea of different forms of schooling, like the charter schooling, in the following sense. If you're a parent in a neighborhood with a really terrible school, and I could show you those neighborhoods, I've lived in some of them, the idea that you don't have a choice and that you have to send your kid to that school because you're too poor to pursue any other option is just horrible. And for us to somehow kick back and say we want to preserve that is completely irresponsible. The problem is, so I support choice for people in that situation. The problem is that the evidence in favor of charter schools has been anything but supportive, as far as I can tell. And I'm not an expert either. I think it's been like pretty unconvincing. It's also worrisome in an adverse selection sense. Remember, for you to take your kid out of the public school and put them in the charter school, that's up to you as the parent. And that means that the parents who actually are concerned about their kids' future are the ones who are going to make that move, leading to an adverse selection problem with the kids left back in the already lousy public school, which is now even that much worse. So I don't know that it's the solution that will help, and although a solution is very much called for. Rick Collenberg has done some work that I've thought has been pretty smart in terms of integrating schools that are integrating schools by class versus race, and I thought that those kinds of experiments look useful.
So could you each talk about social mobility? And in particular, I've seen conflicting evidence on whether social mobility in the U.S. has been impaired relative to, say, the 70s or 80s or before. So could you give a reading of your literature on what's happening with social mobility in the United States, and then to the extent to which that affects your broader views about income inequality?
I think the best evidence comes from a recent study by Raj Chetty and
That's
some
what
co-authors.
was referred to in the question, yeah.
And Raj Chetty finds there's been very little change in income mobility. He looks at the income percentile of the parent and the income percentile of the child as an adult, and finds that the relationship has not changed over time. It's been pretty steady. I think the most surprising thing about the Chetty numbers, which actually shows up in the previous literature as well, is not the fact it hasn't changed. I think that's surprising but interesting. But I think the actual magnitude of the numbers often surprise people. So let me give you sort of a sense of it. Suppose that you have a parent who's at the 99th percentile, top of the income distribution. Where do you think his child's going to be? Now, if we had a perfectly static society, he'd be at the 99th percentile too. If we had perfect mobility, no correlation at all between parents and children, he would be at the 50th percentile. So someplace between 50 and 99th is the sort of plausible range. Where do you think the child's going to be? Somebody, I want to volunteer. Somebody take a guess. So you're 99th percentile parent. What do you expect your kid to be?
How much does he inherit?
Well, don't look at income. I mean, for most people, inheritances are fairly small. I mean, you're right. For the billionaires, the typical 99th percentile guy is not. Let's say that he's making $400,000 a year. Inheritances are not going to be huge. It's not like your Bill Gates. So what income do you think he's going to have? 92nd. I think that's what most people think. They think it's going to be pretty high. Well, obviously not 99. Turns out it's about 65. So what you find in these studies is, to me, I think more mobility than most people expect. Now, of course, the glass is half empty and half full. So it's someplace in the middle. But I think when actually people look at the data, I think they're usually surprised about the amount of mobility there is. I should know, by the way, there's actually some debate about that. Those are the Chetty numbers. There's a guy named Greg Clark who has a book that finds much higher numbers using historical records from the UK, I think primarily. But those are I think the Chetty numbers are the best that we have.
I think that the mobility discussion sometimes takes place in a way, and I don't disagree with much of what I don't disagree with the facts that Greg just shared at all. But I think that the mobility discussion takes place in a way that somehow gets skewed. As somehow, because we have X amount of mobility, the inequality problem isn't as severe. And in fact, I would say that that's wrong. I very much agree with a lot of the research. The Chetty stuff didn't surprise me because I've been seeing and doing research like that for a long time. It was actually pretty well known that income mobility was stable. The problem is you've got stable mobility and increasing inequality. So the gap between the bottom and the middle and the top is getting wider. But the rate at which people are moving across those quintiles is the same, or deciles or percentiles is the same. So it's as if if you think of the economy as a building with a really a terrible apartment in the basement and a decent apartment in the middle and a great apartment at the penthouse, what you actually need is that building gets longer and the distance between the hovel in the basement and the penthouse at the top gets further away. You actually need a faster elevator. So the fact that that mobility has been stable, I don't take much solace in at all. We actually need accelerating mobility if we're going to offset greater inequality. Unfortunately, in the United States, relative to other countries, we have considerably lower mobility, and precisely the metric that Greg mentioned, this idea of how well the son or the daughter, typically sons because we have the data on sons longer, but how well the child does relative to the parent. If you look at other advanced economies, that correlation between how the child does relative to the parent is considerably lower than that of the U.S. And if you plot inequality against that mobility, you'll find that the U.S. is an outlier with very high inequality, very low mobility relative to other advanced economies.
So now that you've taken the discussion abroad, I have questions for both of you. Are there lessons from other countries that we either, regardless of your view on the income inequality, that we ought to be considering? And I'm thinking of German apprenticeships or the Scandinavian countries that have redesigned their welfare systems, different unemployment schemes. So are there lessons from abroad that we could adopt that would presumably be pro-growth in the U.S. and help deal with some of the stuff that we've talked about?
I mean, I don't see Western Europe as being a model.
What about
that we wanna
Scandinavia?
emulate, generally. I'll tell you one thing that we do see in Europe that I do think we probably will and should adopt in the United States, and that's a value-added tax. I think, as Jared said earlier, we're gonna have to raise taxes on more than just the rich, and I agree with that, given the large promises that baby boomers like Jared and I have made to ourselves and promised the next generation is gonna pay for. That we're going to eventually have to raise taxes, I think, to finance that entitlement system. And I think that a value-added tax would be a plausible way to do that, in the sense that it is a consumption tax and relatively efficient way to do that. I say that even though most Republicans hate the idea because they think it's a hidden tax and therefore too easy for Congress to raise. I think there's some truth to that, but I think it is also a very efficient tax in the sense that it gives fairly low distortions compared to other taxes. Another thing that Europe has that we have in terms of the tax system is much higher energy taxes. And I've written many places that higher energy taxes are the way to go, not only because it's relatively efficient, but actually it improves efficiency. Rather than having deadweight losses, it actually internalizes a lot of negative externalities associated with energy consumption.
I think there's a lot we could learn from Europe in terms of reducing inequality. And interestingly, your quip about Europe being kind of a macroeconomic basket case in some of these economies, I kind of look at that as more of stuff they learned from us. What did they used to say about China, that we sell them toxic assets and they sell us toxic toys. So anyway. It's interesting that you mentioned the apprenticeship program. I think Germany apprenticeships are actually a very interesting model for us. I recently ran a program at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities on paths back to full employment. And all the papers there are on a website called, I think, pathtofullemployment.org or something like that. But there's a paper by Harry Holzer and Bob Lerman on precisely this idea. And I think it's a neat idea in terms of using on-the-job training and apprenticeship programs to increase the employment of particularly mostly non-college educated kids who are having trouble getting into the job market. I think European has done some pretty active manufacturing policies that are helpful. The president himself is trying to replicate some of those in a very small scale way. He doesn't have congressional help, but I think I think there are bridges or nexuses between the government and the manufacturing sector that some European economies tap well. There's work sharing, which is in Germany, but other European programs did this. It's a way of using unemployment insurance to keep people on the job during downturns. I think that helps. And I think a much deeper safety net in terms of work supports. We want low-income people to go to work. I said let's provide them with jobs. We also need to provide them with work supports. Greg likes the Earned Income Tax Credit. I like it too. It's a $60 billion a year work support, so it's something we already are into pretty deeply. But I would do more of that, including child care as well. It's a very expensive proposition for working parents.
So in just a few minutes we have left, I want to turn to politics. So one of the things that characterizes both of you is you've both worked in presidential administrations. Obviously, part of what has to be done is leadership. And if we were to just take the things that you agreed on today, right, leave aside the disagreements, there's an awful lot there. So could you each finish by talking about the role of political leadership in advancing the most important things that you think have to be done from an economic standpoint?
I think fundamentally, for better or worse, the American people get the government that they want. and that if we want better policy, it's not so much to convince our so-called elected leaders, but rather to convince the American people that these are the right policies. We call them our elected leaders, but in some sense, since they want to get elected, they actually have to be our elected followers. They follow the American people. So, for example, I'm in favor of higher energy taxes. I've written several places about that. It's actually, I think a lot of economists are. I guess I could get Jared on board with that one. I think we could talk we're blue in the face to our elected leaders about the virtues of higher energy taxes, and they'd say, yeah, I understand the arguments, but I want to get elected. I think we need to convince, if we're going to ever have that, we'd have to convince the American people. And therefore, I think that when we economists talk to the general public, in forums like this and op-ed pages, we're in some sense doing more of a public service than when we talk to our elected leaders, because ultimately it's you guys who decide what the policy should be.
Sorry, what's the question again?
Political leadership, although,
Yeah.
or followership.
Yeah. I think Greg pretty much nailed that one. I mean, I think the idea is that there is I've worked, as you mentioned, I've worked, it's been my great privilege to work at the highest levels of political economy power, as it were, at least in government. And I can tell you that there are people that I would call very smart, and I think Greg would agree, who have very good ideas on how to ameliorate some of the problems that we've been talking about. And as you correctly suggested, and your work is getting to this, there's actually a circle around some of these ideas kind of in the middle of the scale that's not too far left and not too far right that a lot of people agree with, including politicians in high office. And they can't get anywhere with it. What do they say, that the DC stands for dysfunctional Congress? There's a serious, the way I would put the problem that Greg described, to put it in economic terms, which won't maybe not so resonant, is that people have a very high discount rate. They don't really give much of a crap about the future. And I think the job that economists have to do, and policymakers, is to try to somehow pull the future forward in ways that people today actually think about in meaningful terms what kind of world they want for their kids. What kind of world they want in terms of opportunity, in terms of education, in terms of climate. That has to intersect with politicians who are willing to tell the truth about how you get to that kind of world. And that intersection is very, very tough to achieve. I haven't seen it for a long time. I feel like we've been drifting away from it. But that's what's needed. Unfortunately, in grad school, they don't teach you much about this. And I don't know that I have great insights in how to get to that world. But that's the one we need to try to head
On
towards.
that point of agreement, we will end. Thank you both, and thanks to all of you.